The day Hollywood looked away. Burbank, California, October 1965. The Warner Brothers lot was already awake before the sun had fully burned the morning haze off the studio rooftops, and by the time Dean Martin arrived, coffee cups in hand and script tucked under his arm, the soundstage assigned to the silencers was pulsing with the peculiar energy only a major production carried. Cables lay like dark veins across the floor, lights were being hoisted into position, carpenters were making last-minute adjustments to the hotel room set, and assistants moved quickly with clipboards pressed to their chests, calling out times and scene numbers in clipped professional tones. To most people it would have looked chaotic. To Dean it looked like another ordinary day at work. Another film, another role, another few weeks of controlled madness in the machine that was Hollywood. Yet there was something in the air that morning that didn't sit right with him. Dean had learned over decades in the business to trust instincts he couldn't always name. He de-walked onto glamorous sets and felt warmth, laughter, ease. He de-walked onto others and felt tension so thick it seemed to cling to his suit jacket. That Tuesday belonged firmly to the second category. Conversations dropped when certain footsteps passed. Jokes were quieter, shorter, carefully chosen. Crew members worked fast but without ease, as if speed might protect them from something invisible but ever-present. The name no one said out loud was the same one everyone felt. Mitchell Harmon. Harmon was already on set, seated in his high-backed director's chair, sunglasses on despite the indoor lighting, one polished shoe hooked casually over the opposite knee. To the outside world, he was untouchable. 12 major films in 10 years, 8 box office hits, 2 Academy Awards. The man studios called when a project was expensive, complicated, and needed to be delivered on time. He was known in trade papers as a perfectionist. Among actors and crews, he was known as something else entirely. Dean had heard the stories before he ever signed his contract. Frank Sinatra had warned him in a half-serious, half-resigned way. The man gets results, Dino, but he leaves wreckage behind him. Mort Viner, Dean's manager, had been blunter. He humiliates people, he breaks them down, and nobody stops him because the pictures make money. Even a Warner executive had delicately hinted over lunch that Harmon could be intense, the word stretched thin to cover a multitude of sins. Dean had shrugged at the time. He'd worked with difficult directors, perfectionists, control freaks, men who mistook cruelty for genius. He knew how to stay in his lane, hit his marks, say his lines, and go home. He needed this film. The Matt Helm series had promise, 4 novels already published, a built-in audience, a chance to move into a new phase of his career without abandoning the charm that had made people love him. So he'd nodded, signed, and told himself he could handle whatever came. What he had not expected was how quickly, intense, would reveal itself as something darker. By mid-morning, they were preparing a simple interior scene. A hotel hallway set, 1 cart, a knock at the door, 12 lines of dialogue. In theory, it was a gift of a scene. In practice, everyone seemed to know it wouldn't be, because the young actor cast as the bellhop was new, unknown, and Mitchell Harmon was not known for patience. Dean noticed the kid almost immediately. He stood off to one side, script folded and unfolded in nervous hands, lips moving soundlessly as he rehearsed. He couldn't have been more than 23. Dark hair, neatly combed, too thin tie. Shoes polished so carefully they reflected the overhead lights. There was something earnest about him that reminded Dean uncomfortably of himself when he'd first come west, before the hits, before the Rat Pack, before the protection of fame. Dean drifted over during a lighting adjustment, pretending to check a mark, and spoke quietly. "You the bellhop?" The young man straightened as if called to attention. "Yes, sir, Bobby Chen." "First picture?" Bobby nodded, trying to smile. "First big one." Dean could see the fear he was trying to hide. It lived in the tightness of his shoulders, the way he inhaled before every line, the way his eyes flicked toward Harmon's chair even when Harmon wasn't speaking. Dean lowered his voice. "You'll be fine. Don't play the scene, play the moment. The camera likes honesty." Bobby let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Thank you, Mr. Martin. That means a lot." Dean patted his shoulder once lightly. "It's Dean." The first take was solid. Bobby hit his marks, delivered his lines cleanly. The timing worked. Dean felt the rhythm of it and thought, almost idly, that'll cut. But Harmon's voice snapped through the soundstage. "Cut again." No explanation, no adjustment, just again. The second take was better. Bobby relaxed slightly, found a more natural cadence, responded to Dean's expressions instead of just his cues. When Harmon called cut, Dean smiled at Bobby, subtle encouragement. Harmon did not smile. That was terrible, Harmon said flatly. You sounded like you were reading stage directions. Where's the life? Where's the urgency? Bobby swallowed. I thought. Don't think, Harmon snapped. Do. They reset. The third take tilted the other way. Bobby added energy, warmth, movement. He tried to meet the invisible target Harmon seemed to keep shifting. Harmon cut them off before the scene was even finished. Now you're mugging. This isn't community theater. This is Warner Brothers. Act like you belong here. Around them, grips pretended to focus on equipment that did not need adjusting. Makeup artists busied themselves with already perfect faces. Everyone could feel the ground tightening. By the fourth take, Bobby's hands were visibly shaking. His voice faltered. He missed a step, stepped on one of Dean's lines. The scene collapsed. Harmon exploded out of his chair. "What is wrong with you?" he shouted, striding onto the set. "Do you have any idea how much this costs? Do you know how many people you're wasting the time of right now?" "I'm sorry," Bobby said, his voice barely audible. "I'm trying." "Trying," Harmon cut in. "Trying is what amateurs do, professionals deliver." Dean took a step forward. "Mitchell, he's nervous. Give him a minute." Harmon rounded on him. "This is my set." "And he's my scene partner," Dean replied evenly. "And he's doing his best." For a moment it looked like Harmon might turn his fire fully on Dean. Instead, he pointed at Bobby, finger inches from the young man's chest. "One more take. If you fail again, you're done." They reset. The soundstage had gone unnaturally quiet. No small talk. No background laughter. Only the soft hum of lights and the distant echo of another production working somewhere across the lot. "Action." Bobby pushed the cart forward, opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The silence stretched, thin and merciless. "Cut." Harmon closed the distance between them in long, furious strides. And then it happened. The sound was sharp, unmistakable, flesh on flesh, a crack that echoed off the painted walls. Bobby's head snapped to the side. His glasses skidded across the floor. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The entire soundstage seemed to forget how to breathe. Dean felt something cold settle in his chest. He did not raise his voice. He did not run, he walked. He picked up the glasses, handed them back to Bobby, looked at the red mark blooming on the young man's cheek. Then he turned, and in that moment, every career calculation Dean Martin had ever learned quietly dissolved. "Mitchell," he said calmly, "you're finished." The words did not land all at once. They rippled outward, across crew members who had never heard anyone challenge Harmon, across assistants who knew exactly how many powerful people stood behind him, across a studio culture built on silence. Harmon laughed once, short and disbelieving. "You don't have the authority." Dean didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Call the studio," he told the assistant director. "Legal now." The assistant hesitated. Dean looked at him. The hesitation ended. Harmon's smile began to fade. "You don't hit people," Dean continued, his tone steady, almost quiet. "Not on my set, not on any set, not ever." Around them no one spoke. No one moved, but something fundamental had shifted. And Hollywood, without knowing it yet, had just crossed a line it would never fully step back over. The price of standing. The soundstage did not immediately erupt after Dean Martin spoke. There was no shouting, no sudden rush of footsteps, no dramatic music swelling in the background the way it might have in one of his own films. Instead, what followed was far heavier, silence. A thick, unsettled silence that pressed itself into every corner of the space. Crew members stood frozen beside lights and cameras, unsure whether they were witnessing the end of a career, the beginning of a lawsuit, or something far worse. Mitchell Harmon remained where he was, his face pale now rather than red, his authority cracked but not yet broken, as if he himself could not fully accept that someone had finally said the one word he had never heard on a set before. Finished. Bobby Chen still stood near the hotel door, glasses back on his face, hands clenched at his sides, eyes unfocused with shock. Dean placed himself subtly between the young actor and Harmon, not in a theatrical way, not with puffed chest or dramatic gestures, but in the quiet, unmistakable way of a man making it clear where he stood. To those who knew Dean only as the smooth crooner or the relaxed television host, the shift might have been surprising. To those who truly understood him, it was not. Dean Martin did not posture. When he decided something, he occupied it. Harmon tried to recover his footing by leaning into what had always protected him, status. He spoke of budgets, of schedules, of studio contracts, of how productions collapsed when emotions overruled professional discipline. He reminded Dean, loudly enough for others to hear, of how many millions were tied up in this film, how many careers depended on him delivering it, how replaceable actors were, even famous ones, when studios decided they were trouble. His words were not merely anger. They were warnings, they were threats dressed in industry language. They were the old Hollywood law spoken out loud: power protects itself. Dean listened without interruption. When Harmon finished, Dean did not counter with fame or money. He did not recite his box office numbers. He did not mention Sinatra or Vegas or television ratings. He said only, "You crossed a line, and you don't get to decide where it is." The assistant director returned breathless, followed minutes later by two studio executives and a legal representative. They arrived expecting a production delay. What they found instead was a frozen set and a young actor with a visible mark on his face. The conversations that followed did not happen in front of the crew. They happened behind the thin walls of an office trailer where voices were kept low, but emotions were not. Dean explained what happened calmly, clearly, without embellishment. 3 crew members were called in. Their stories matched. Bobby was asked if he needed medical attention. He shook his head, but the trembling in his hands betrayed him. The lawyer took notes. The executives exchanged looks that carried the unmistakable weight of risk assessment. Lawsuits, press, insurance, contracts, reputation, it all hung in the cramped air. Mitchell Harmon argued. He framed it as discipline, as stress, as a misunderstanding. He reminded them of awards and profits and deadlines, but something had shifted beyond his control. The handprint on Bobby's cheek could not be spun. The witnesses could not be silenced. And Dean Martin, sitting with one ankle crossed over the other, watching the men who represented the studio calculate, did not budge. He made it clear that he would not return to the set while Harmon remained. He made it equally clear that if the studio chose the director over the people he worked with, he would walk. It was not a speech. It was a statement. For the first time that morning, Harmon looked afraid. When the decision came, it did not come with ceremony. One executive cleared his throat and said they were suspending Harmon from the production effective immediately pending review. Harmon objected. The lawyer responded that his contract allowed termination for cause. Harmon demanded to know if they understood what this would cost. Dean stood, straightened his jacket, and said, "Less than it costs to keep pretending this is acceptable." Harmon left the trailer alone. Outside, word traveled fast. Sets are porous places. Within minutes, grips, makeup artists, extras, electricians, and assistants knew something unprecedented had happened. They did not cheer. They did not clap. Many of them simply watched Harmon cross the lot with his shoulders rigid and his face fixed forward, the same way they had watched others leave before, only never someone like him. The message did not need to be spoken aloud. Everyone felt it. Production was halted. Equipment powered down. People were dismissed early. Some lingered in small knots of conversation, speaking in hushed tones as if the studio itself might be listening. Others avoided talking altogether, as if words might somehow undo what had just occurred. Bobby sat alone on a folding chair, staring at the floor, his script still folded in his hand. Dean joined him, not as a star, not as a producer, but as a man who understood the hollow space that follows shock. "You didn't deserve that," Dean said quietly. Bobby nodded but didn't look up. I thought maybe this was just how it worked." Dean let the sentence sit between them. He had heard variations of it his entire life. "It doesn't," he replied, "and it doesn't change unless someone decides it doesn't." Bobby finally looked at him then, eyes wet, voice unsteady. "They'll never hire me again." Dean met his gaze. "They will, and if anyone doesn't, that tells you something about them, not about you." What Dean did not say, what he could not promise, was how many doors might quietly close. He felt the weight of that truth settle on him as the day wore on, and he returned home earlier than expected, the echo of the slap still ringing faintly in his ears. Fame did not make a man immune to consequences. It simply changed the scale of them. That evening, as he sat alone with a drink he barely touched, Dean thought of the unspoken rules he had learned in Hollywood. Don't embarrass studios, don't disrupt productions, don't challenge men who make money. He had broken all 3 before lunch. The phone began ringing before dinner. Some calls were cautious. Agents wanting details, executives wanting reassurance, publicists asking what he intended to say if the story leaked. Others were quieter, actors who had worked under Harmon and were not surprised, crew members who had endured worse and were grateful someone had finally said something. And then there were the calls that did not come at all, people who normally checked in, people who suddenly had meetings, people who would, for now, watch from a distance. Late that night, Dean sat on his patio, the Lowe's Angel's air cool against his skin, and felt something he had not expected to feel so strongly. Not pride, not fear, but responsibility. He had not planned to become a line anyone else might stand behind. He had not set out to test how much weight his name could carry. But now that he had, he could not pretend it didn't matter. What happened next would not belong only to him or Harmon or Bobby. It would belong to every person on that lot who had ever swallowed an insult because the paycheck was attached to it. Every young actor who had been told suffering was part of the price. Every crew member who had learned to keep their head down and their mouth shut. The next morning, the trades began calling. By noon, the studio's silence had become its own headline. And across Hollywood, in offices and soundstages and backlot trailers, people were starting to ask a question they had not asked out loud before. What happens now? When the system fights back? By the third day after production shut down, the silence that had initially followed the incident no longer existed. It had been replaced by noise. Telephones rang endlessly in studio offices. Typewriters clacked in newsrooms. Rumors moved faster than facts, sliding across Hollywood like wind through open doors. What began as whispers on the Warner lot was now a story searching for a headline, and stories, Dean Martin understood, did not care about anyone's comfort once they were loose. The first article appeared in a small afternoon trade, cautiously worded, heavy on phrases like alleged confrontation and production dispute. It mentioned that a director had been removed from a major picture. It did not yet mention a slap. By the following morning, 3 papers had the story, each a little bolder than the last. By evening, the words could no longer be avoided. Physical altercation, witnesses, young actor, Dean Martin intervened. The image Hollywood had spent decades polishing, glamour, control, effortless brilliance, had cracked just enough for people to peer inside. Dean watched it unfold from his living room, reading clippings his assistant delivered, listening to radio reports that spoke his name in tones of intrigue rather than admiration. He had faced publicity storms before, but those had usually been tied to films, romances, Vegas shows. This was different. This cut close to the machinery of the industry itself, and industries, when threatened, rarely respond with grace. Within 48 hours, the phone calls shifted. The first wave had been curiosity, the second was calculation. Studio executives who had been warm a week earlier now spoke carefully, every sentence shaped like a contract clause. Some told him he had done the right thing, but followed it with reminders about obligations, about schedules, about the difficulty of replacing directors mid-production. A few suggested delicately that the incident could have been handled internally, that there were systems, procedures, committees. Dean listened, thanked them, and did not apologize. Agents called with concern masked as advice. They spoke of perception, of how quickly narratives hardened, of how the town remembered disruptions longer than intentions. One well-connected manager said it outright. There are people who will never forgive you for costing them money. Dean's response was simple. Then they weren't people I was trying to please. Not all resistance was subtle. By the end of the week, rumors had begun circulating that Dean had exaggerated, that he was difficult, that he was using his star power to control productions, that Harmon had been provoked, that the young actor was unstable. None of it was printed yet, but Dean could hear the familiar machinery warming up. Smear campaigns rarely announce themselves. They arrive in suggestion, in tone, in anonymous quotes passed quietly to reporters who want to keep their access. What surprised the studio executives, what they had not fully predicted, was the second story rising alongside the first. People began calling the papers. At first, it was a veteran lighting technician who had worked under Harmon years earlier, speaking carefully, unwilling to go on record, describing an environment where screaming was normal and humiliation was routine. Then it was a wardrobe assistant who had left a production after being publicly belittled until she cried. Then a character actor who described having a script thrown at his head during a rehearsal. None of these stories were spectacular enough to dominate headlines on their own. Together, they formed something far more dangerous. Pattern. By the time a major entertainment weekly ran its piece, the headline no longer centered on Dean Martin. It centered on Mitchell Harmon. The article laid out his career alongside accounts of his methods. It quoted unnamed crew members. It described fear as a directing tool. It framed his removal not as an isolated clash of egos, but as a moment that exposed a long-protected culture. The studio issued a brief statement confirming Harmon's termination and reiterating its commitment to professional standards. It was corporate language, smooth and non-committal, but its existence alone signaled that the situation was no longer containable. Dean felt the shift. He felt it in the tone of the calls. He felt it in the sudden interest from people who had never spoken to him before. He felt it in the messages left on his answering machine from actors he barely knew, thanking him for what he had done, not as a gesture of celebrity, but as a gesture of permission. Permission to say, "This happened to me too." Permission to admit that the old rules were not laws of nature. He also felt the cost. 2 projects that had been in discussion quietly stopped calling. A producer he had known for years postponed a lunch meeting indefinitely. A script he had been offered was suddenly moving in another direction. None of it was dramatic enough to point to, but all of it was real enough to recognize. Hollywood rarely punishes directly. It simply opens fewer doors. One evening, as the stories continued to build, Dean drove back to the lot to retrieve personal items from his trailer. The place looked different in the late light. Quieter. Less like a machine, more like a town. He saw Bobby across the lot, speaking with one of the assistant producers. The young man's posture was still guarded, but something in his stance had changed. He was no longer shrinking. They spoke beside the open door of Dean's trailer. Bobby admitted that his agent had warned him not to talk to reporters, that some casting offices were suddenly busy, that he was afraid the only thing people would ever associate him with was the incident. Dean listened. Then he said something he had never said lightly in his life. "You didn't choose to be part of this, but you are, so you get to choose what you make of it." Bobby looked at him, uncertain. "What if it costs me everything?" Dean didn't soften the truth. "It might cost you some things, it will also save you others, your dignity for one, and there are careers that come from silence, and there are careers that come from being able to look yourself in the mirror. Only one of those lasts." Bobby nodded slowly, absorbing that. He did not look relieved, but he looked steadier. Behind them, somewhere across the lot, a different production called action. The sound echoed faintly, a reminder that Hollywood never stopped moving. It simply rerouted. By the end of that week, the narrative had fully turned. Harmon was no longer simply a successful director removed from a film. He was becoming a symbol of what had been tolerated, of what had been hidden, of what happened when money insulated behavior long enough for people to forget that it was behavior at all. Dean Martin's name was now permanently attached to the moment the insulation failed. He understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the story, that what he had done would not dismantle an industry, but it had cracked a wall, and cracks invite light, and light invites others to step forward. The system was pushing back, but the system, for the first time in a long while, was also being forced to look at itself. And that, Dean knew as he drove home under the deepening California sky, was something even Hollywood could not entirely undo. What remains when the cameras stop? By the time production on the silencers officially resumed under a new director, Hollywood no longer spoke of the incident as a dispute. It was now openly referred to as what it had been from the beginning, a breaking point. The studio had moved carefully but decisively, releasing a public statement that emphasized professional conduct and confirming that Mitchell Harmon was no longer associated with any of their projects. Insurance companies quietly adjusted their policies. Contracts quietly gained new language. Meetings quietly included new conversations. None of it was celebrated. None of it was dramatic, but it was real. And real change in Hollywood had always arrived that way, not with applause, but with altered paperwork and altered expectations. The new director, Phil Carlson, did something on his very first morning that surprised the crew more than any speech could have. He gathered everyone on set before cameras were powered on, before a single light was adjusted, and spoke not about schedules or budgets, but about people. He said he had reviewed the footage from the previous week. He said the performances were strong. He said no film was worth fear. He said no shot required humiliation. He said this set would be run on respect or not at all. Then he dismissed everyone to work. The simplicity of it carried more weight than any lecture could have. It signaled that something had already changed. Bobby Chen's scene was reshot that afternoon. It took 2 takes, not because Bobby had suddenly become someone else, but because the air around him had. The tension that had once hollowed his voice was gone. In its place was ease, timing, playfulness. The thing casting directors had seen in him before fear had taught him to doubt it. When Carlson called cut, he smiled and said they had it. Bobby blinked as if he had not expected the words to exist for him. Dean watched from his mark, feeling something settle inside him that had been restless since the soundstage went silent days earlier. Not satisfaction, Not triumph, something quieter, a sense of rightness. Production finished on schedule. The film went on to do well. Critics wrote about its humor, its timing, its charm. Audiences came, sequels followed. Hollywood, as it always did, continued making pictures, but beneath the familiar surface, small adjustments persisted. Directors who had long relied on intimidation found themselves confronted by crews less willing to accept it. Actors, especially younger ones, spoke to each other more openly about working conditions. Studios, ever practical, recognized that lawsuits and public reckoning were more expensive than enforcing standards had ever been. It was not a revolution. It was an evolution, and it had a visible point of reference. Years passed. Dean Martin continued to work, to perform, to live inside the complicated space of public life. The incident receded from headlines. New controversies replaced it. New stars rose. New legends were built. But the story did not disappear. It changed forms. It became something assistants whispered to each other when a director raised his voice too high. Something acting teachers mentioned when students asked what they were allowed to accept. Something veteran crew members told newcomers over coffee when explaining how the business used to be, and how it did not have to be that way anymore. Bobby Chen built a career not of stardom but of steadiness. He worked. He improved. He became reliable. He earned a reputation as someone who arrived prepared and treated people well. He spoke occasionally about the incident, but never with bitterness. He framed it instead as the moment he learned that survival did not have to mean surrender. In time, he began speaking to younger actors, not as a victim, but as someone who had seen both sides of power and chosen which one he intended to belong to. Nearly 3 decades after the day that altered the course of his life, Bobby stood on a small stage at a Screen Actors Guild event, receiving an award not for fame but for contribution. During his acceptance speech, he told the story again. He described the fear, the silence, the sound he would never forget, and then he spoke of Dean Martin, not as an icon, not as a star, but as a man who walked forward when everyone else stayed still. He said that moment had not only saved his career. It had given him a standard, a way to measure himself when no one was watching. Dean watched the broadcast from home. He was older now, quieter, less interested in what his name opened and more interested in what it stood for. When Bobby finished speaking, Dean sat for a long while with the television still glowing faintly in the room. The applause washed over the speakers. He did not smile. He did not tear up. He simply breathed, slow and even, and thought of a Tuesday afternoon long past when he had not known he was doing anything remarkable. He had simply known what he could not accept. He called Bobby the next morning. They spoke not about awards, but about work, about how sets felt different now, about how young actors spoke up sooner, about how fear, once accepted as the price of entry, had begun to lose its authority. Before they hung up, Bobby reminded him of something Dean had said beside a trailer years earlier, about choosing which kind of power you become. Dean listened. Then he replied, "You chose well." Mitchell Harmon never truly returned to the industry. He tried, he pitched, he blamed. But his name had become a liability studios did not need. His story ended not with redemption or triumph, but with quiet absence. And in Hollywood, absence is the loudest judgment of all. When Dean Martin passed away, the obituaries spoke, as they always had, of music and movies and comedy and charm. But among actors, among crews, among those who worked where fame did not reach, another story was told just as often. The story of a man who could have walked away, who could have stayed silent, who could have protected only himself, and did not. At his memorial, one of the speakers said something simple that stayed with those who heard it. Dean Martin was many things, but the one that mattered most was this: when it was easier to look away, he didn't. Hollywood did not change because one star raised his voice. It changed because one person refused to accept that success excused harm. Because one man remembered that before there are careers, there are people. Before there are productions, there are lives. And before there is power, there is responsibility. Long after the sets were struck and the scripts shelved and the headlines yellowed, that remained. And in the quiet spaces between takes, in the moments when someone younger hesitated and someone older stepped forward, the legacy of that afternoon in 1965 continued to do what the best stories always do. It reminded people who they could choose to be.